The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 days ago, and Rose Nolan hadn't moved from the driver's seat since her husband's body grew cold beside her. She sat there on the mountain pass, 20 miles from anywhere, staring at nothing while the November wind cut through her threadbare shawl. Thomas had been coughing blood for 2 weeks, but he'd insisted they keep moving toward California, toward the dream of an orchard and a white house with blue shutters. The dream died with him somewhere in the Nevada territory, and Rose found she couldn't remember why any of it had mattered. The mules had wandered off yesterday, still hitched together, and she'd watched them go without feeling anything at all. Grief had hollowed her out so completely that hunger, thirst, and cold seemed like distant concerns happening to someone else's body. The sound of hooves on rock barely registered until a massive shadow fell across the wagon. Rose didn't look up. If it was bandits come to rob her, they'd find nothing. If it was death itself, she'd welcome it. "Madam." The voice was deep, roughened by weather and solitude. "You hurt." She finally lifted her head. The man sitting astride the buckskin horse was unlike anyone she'd seen in her 22 years. He wore buckskin clothing decorated with fringe and beadwork, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face bronzed by sun and wind. His dark blonde beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale blue and startling in their intensity. He looked to be perhaps 30, though the wilderness had a way of making men look older than their years. "No," Rose said, her voice cracking from disuse. "Not hurt." His gaze moved past her to where Thomas lay wrapped in a blanket, those pale eyes softened with understanding. "How long ago?" 3 days. Maybe 4. Time had become meaningless. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace and approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. Up close, she could see he stood well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and strong in the way of men who lived by their own labor. "Name's Ethan Shepard. I've got a cabin about 5 miles north of here. You'll come with me." It wasn't a question, but Rose shook her head anyway. "I have nowhere to go." "Nothing left. You've got your life," Ethan said simply. "That's something." "Is it?" The words came out bitter as wormwood. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, became almost tender. "I lost my wife 4 years back. Cholera took her on the trail. I know that emptiness you're feeling, madam. I know it well enough to tell you that sitting here waiting to die won't honor his memory." Rose wanted to argue, but she couldn't find the energy. When Ethan held out his hand, she stared at it as if she'd forgotten what the gesture meant. "I'll see to your husband proper," he said gently. "Give him a decent burial with words said over him. Then you'll come to my cabin, rest, eat something, and decide what comes next. I have enough for both of us. You can stay and heal, take whatever time you need." Something in his voice, patient and kind without a trace of expectation, finally penetrated the fog surrounding her heart. Rose placed her trembling hand in his larger one and let him help her down from the wagon. Her legs nearly gave out, and Ethan caught her easily, supporting her weight as if it were nothing. "When did you last eat?" "I don't remember." He made a low sound of concern and guided her to sit on a fallen log while he tended to Thomas. Rose watched distantly as this stranger showed more care and respect to her dead husband than seemed possible from someone who'd never known him. Ethan found the small folding shovel in the wagon bed and spent 2 hours digging into the rocky soil, creating a grave deep enough that animals wouldn't disturb it. He fashioned a cross from 2 branches bound with leather cord, and when everything was ready, he came to help Rose to her feet. The burial was simple but dignified. Ethan spoke words from Scripture, his voice steady and sure, and when he finished, he stood silent while Rose said her private goodbye. She hadn't cried since Thomas died, but now tears finally came, Not the wild sobbing she'd expected, but a quiet, steady rain of grief. Ethan didn't rush her. He stood a respectful distance away, hat in his hands, waiting until she'd cried herself empty. When she finally turned from the grave, he simply nodded and began gathering what he could salvage from the wagon. There wasn't much. Her trunk of clothes, Thomas's rifle, a few cooking implements, and a small wooden box containing her mother's Bible and the daguerreotype of their wedding day. "The wagon and goods will stay here," Ethan said, securing her trunk behind his saddle and fashioning a travois for the rest. "This road doesn't see much traffic this time of year, but come spring, someone might find use for it." He lifted Rose onto his horse as if she weighed nothing more than a child, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and she found herself enclosed in warmth and the smell of wood smoke, leather, and pine. It should have felt improper, riding this way with a strange man, but Rose was too exhausted to care about propriety. The 5-mile journey took nearly 2 hours with the travois dragging behind, but Ethan never showed impatience. He kept the horse to a walk, and twice when Rose started to slip sideways in exhaustion, his arm tightened around her waist, holding her secure. "Almost there," he murmured when they crested a ridge. "See that smoke?" Rose forced her eyes to focus. Below them, nestled in a valley where a creek ran silver through the pines, stood a cabin. It was larger than she'd expected, built from hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a steady plume. A well-built barn stood nearby, and she could see chickens pecking in a yard, a milk cow in a small pasture, and what looked like a vegetable garden, now dormant for winter. "You built all this yourself?" The question came out before she could stop it. "Most of it." "Had help with the barn a few years back from some trappers passing through." There was quiet pride in his voice. "It's not much, but it's home." To Rose, who'd spent the last year traveling in a cramped wagon, sleeping on hard ground and cooking over open fires, the cabin looked like a palace. As they drew closer, she noticed other details. Split firewood stacked high under a lean-to, stretching racks with animal pelts, a smokehouse, and even glass windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Ethan dismounted first, then lifted Rose down with careful hands. Her legs had gone numb from the ride and she stumbled. He caught her again, and this time he simply scooped her up and carried her toward the cabin door. "I can walk," Rose protested weakly. "Maybe, but you don't need to." He shouldered open the door and brought her into warmth and golden lamplight. The interior of the cabin was a single large room, but it had been divided thoughtfully. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area to one side complete with a proper stove. The other side held a table with 2 chairs, both carved from pine and polished smooth. In the far corner stood a bed with a thick mattress and what looked like a bearskin coverlet. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes, food stores, and books. Books. Rose hadn't expected a mountain man to own books. Ethan set her in one of the chairs by the fire and immediately began building up the flames. "You'll sleep there," he said, nodding toward the bed. "I'll make up a pallet by the hearth." "I couldn't possibly take your bed," Rose said, though even speaking felt like an enormous effort. "You can and will." His tone was firm but kind. "Now sit quiet while I make you something to eat." Rose meant to argue further, but her eyes had already drifted shut. She was dimly aware of Ethan moving around the cabin, the sound of water being poured, the clank of a pot on the stove. The warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, and for the first time in weeks she felt almost safe. She woke to Ethan touching her shoulder gently. "Madam, Rose. You need to eat something." A bowl of soup sat on the table, steam rising from it in fragrant curls. Rose's stomach, which had been a tight knot of grief, suddenly reminded her she was starving. The soup was thick with venison, potatoes, and wild onions, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. She ate slowly at first, then faster, and when she'd finished, Ethan refilled the bowl without comment. "There's bread if you want it, and I've got honey." Rose nodded, and he brought her a thick slice of dark bread spread with golden honey. It tasted like heaven. "You made this?" "I did. Not much else to do during the long winters." He poured her a cup of water from a bucket. "When you're finished, you should sleep proper. There's a screen in the corner if you want privacy to change." The mention of changing made Rose suddenly aware of how filthy she was, how her dress was stained with trail dust and grief and the evidence of a journey gone wrong. "I don't want to dirty your bed." "I've got water heating," Ethan said, anticipating her need. "You can wash first." "I'll step outside while you do." It was too much kindness from a stranger, and Rose felt tears threatening again. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes distant. "When my Sarah died, I wanted to die too, thought about it more than once. But an old Shoshone woman found me half frozen in the mountains, brought me to her family's winter camp, and they nursed me back to health. Took 2 months before I could even speak her name without breaking. They didn't know me either, but they knew grief. They knew what it was to lose everything." He met Rose's eyes. "I guess you could say I'm paying forward the kindness they showed me." Before Rose could respond, he'd hauled in a large copper tub from somewhere outside and began filling it with hot water from the stove and cold from the bucket. When it was ready, he gathered his coat and hat. "Take your time. I've got to see to the animals anyway. There's soap and a towel on the shelf there. Your trunk is by the screen." Then he was gone, closing the door softly behind him, and Rose was alone in the warm cabin with a tub of steaming water waiting. She stood slowly, her body aching from days of immobility, and moved behind the screen. Her dress came off in layers, each piece more filthy than the last. When she finally sank into the water, she couldn't hold back a small sound of relief. She washed her hair with the soap, which smelled of pine and something sweet, maybe lavender. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink and clean. She let herself soak until the water began to cool, and only then did she force herself to climb out and dry off. Her trunk held only a few dresses, all of them plain and practical. She chose a gray wool one, warm enough for the mountain cold, and dressed slowly, braiding her wet hair over one shoulder. When Ethan returned half an hour later, she was sitting by the fire again, feeling more human than she had in weeks. He took in her cleaned appearance with a small nod of approval. "Better. Yes, thank you." The words felt inadequate for what he'd done, but they were all she had. He emptied the tub, carrying it outside in trips, then hung a blanket from hooks in the ceiling, creating a barrier between the bed and the rest of the room. "For your privacy," he explained. "I know this isn't proper, you being here with me, but there's no other choice right now. Come spring, if you want, I can take you to Silver Peak. That's the nearest town, about 30 miles south. But winter's coming on hard, and these mountains aren't safe for travel once the snows start." "I understand." Rose paused. "You keep saying Silver Peak. That's in Nevada territory." "It is. We're about halfway between there and the California border, high up in the mountains. Silver Peak's a mining town, sprung up about 5 years back when they found silver in the hills. It's rough but growing. Has a hotel, a general store, even a church now." The mention of spring, of decisions to be made, felt overwhelming. Rose couldn't think past the next hour, let alone the next season. "I have no money," she said quietly. "Thomas and we spent everything we had on the wagon and supplies. I can't pay you for your hospitality." "I'm not asking you to." Ethan pulled the other chair closer to the fire and sat, his long legs stretched toward the warmth. You can help around here if it makes you feel better about staying. There's cooking and mending and such. But mostly, you'll rest and heal. That's payment enough, seeing you get your strength back. Rose studied him in the firelight. He had a strong face, weathered but handsome, with small lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. There was a quietness about him, a sense of someone comfortable with silence and solitude. How long have you lived out here? 7 years, give or take. Came west after Sarah died. We'd been heading to Oregon, planning to farm, but after she passed, I couldn't stomach the idea of joining a settlement. Found this valley by accident, decided it was as good a place as any to be alone. He glanced at her. I trap in winter, mostly beaver and fox. Trade the pelts in Silver Peak come spring. Hunt year-round. The garden keeps me in vegetables, and I've got the chickens for eggs, the cow for milk. It's a simple life, but it's mine. Don't you get lonely? The question slipped out before Rose could stop it. Too personal for someone she'd known only a few hours. But Ethan didn't seem offended. Sometimes, he admitted. But loneliness is better than the wrong kind of company. Out here, I don't have to pretend I'm not grieving. Don't have to smile when I don't feel like it, or make small talk with folks who don't understand. The mountains don't expect anything from me except respect. Rose understood that in her bones. The thought of being around people right now, people who would offer platitudes and expect her to be brave, felt unbearable. I think I understand. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Ethan stood and began spreading blankets on the floor near the hearth, making himself a bed. You should sleep now. Tomorrow will come early. Rose moved behind the hanging blanket and climbed into the bed. The mattress was stuffed with what felt like feathers, impossibly soft after months on the hard wagon bed. The bearskin coverlet was heavy and warm, and beneath it were quilts that smelled of cedar. She should have felt strange, sleeping in a strange man's bed in the middle of the wilderness. But instead she felt safe for the first time since Thomas took his last rattling breath. She woke once in the night to the sound of wind howling around the cabin and Ethan adding wood to the fire. Through the gap in the blanket barrier, she could see him silhouetted against the flames, and she felt grateful beyond words that she wasn't alone in the world anymore. Morning came with pale light filtering through the windows and the smell of coffee brewing. Rose emerged from behind the blanket to find Ethan already up, dressed in his buckskins with breakfast cooking on the stove. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in months." It was true. Despite everything, despite the grief still sitting heavy in her chest, she'd slept deeply and dreamlessly. "Good. There's a privy out back about 20 yards. I keep a path cleared." He nodded toward her trunk. "You'll want a shawl. It's cold this morning." The next days fell into a rhythm. Ethan would rise before dawn, tend the animals, chop wood, or work on whatever needed doing. Rose would wake to find breakfast waiting and Ethan already gone, giving her privacy. She'd eat slowly, washing the dishes afterward, and then she'd find small tasks to occupy her hands. She mended shirts she found in a basket, darned socks, and organized his pantry. The work was mindless but soothing. Ethan would return for midday dinner, and they'd eat together in companionable silence. He never pressed her to talk, never asked questions about her past, unless she volunteered information. He simply existed alongside her grief, a steady presence that demanded nothing. In the afternoons, if weather permitted, Rose would walk down to the creek. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and she'd sit on the bank wrapped in a blanket, watching it flow. Sometimes Ethan would appear, checking his trap lines or hauling water, and he'd nod to her before continuing his work. Other times she was alone with her thoughts and her tears. A week passed, then two. The first snow came on a morning in late November, fat flakes drifting down like goose feathers. Rose woke to find the world transformed, everything softened and quieted by the white blanket. Ethan was building up the fire, and when he saw her watching, he smiled for the first time since they'd met. Beautiful, isn't it? First snow always makes everything seem new. Rose moved to the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. I've never seen so much snow. We're from Missouri, Thomas and I. We had winters, but nothing like this. Mountains are different. We'll be snowed in pretty solid from now until April, maybe May. But we've got everything we need. Plenty of food stored, firewood enough to last 2 winters, and the animals are all secured in the barn. The thought of being isolated here with Ethan for months should have frightened her. Instead, Rose felt something close to relief. There would be no decisions to make, nowhere she needed to be. Just the quiet cabin and the falling snow and time to heal. That afternoon, Ethan brought out a deck of cards and taught her to play poker. Rose had never gambled in her life, had been raised to believe cards were sinful, but something about the wickedness of it made her laugh for the first time since Thomas died. The sound startled them both. "There it is," Ethan said softly, his pale eyes warm. "I was wondering if you remembered how." "I'm not sure I did," Rose admitted. "Laughing feels strange, wrong somehow. It's not wrong, it's healing." He dealt another hand. "Sarah used to say that grief and joy could live in the same heart. That one didn't cancel out the other. Took me a long time to believe her, but she was right." "What was she like? Your Sarah?" Ethan's hand stilled on the cards, and for a moment Rose thought she'd overstepped. But then he smiled, a distant, bittersweet expression. Small, fierce. She had red hair that curled no matter what she did to it and freckles across her nose. She could outshoot most men and wasn't afraid of anything except spiders. His voice went soft. She laughed at everything, even when things were hard, especially then. Said laughter was the only weapon you could use against despair. "She sounds wonderful." She was. He met Rose's eyes. "What about your husband? Tell me about Thomas." Rose realized she wanted to. She'd been holding Thomas's memory so close, afraid that speaking of him would somehow diminish what they'd had. But now, sitting across from this man who understood loss, the words came easier. He was kind, patient. He worked as a clerk in a dry goods store, and he hated it. Hated being inside all day, hated the dust and the endless columns of numbers. His dream was always California, the orchards and the open sky. He proposed to me with that dream, promised me orange blossoms and sunshine. She smiled sadly. "I would have married him anyway, even without the promise. He had the gentlest hands and the worst singing voice you ever heard. He sang anyway, especially when he thought I wasn't listening." "How long were you married?" 2 years. "We waited, saved every penny for the journey west. Finally had enough last spring and joined a wagon train heading out. But Thomas, he was never strong. Not sickly exactly, just not built for rough living. By the time we reached Fort Laramie, he was coughing. By South Pass, he was coughing blood. I begged him to stop, to rest, but he kept saying we were almost there, just a little further." Her voice cracked. "We weren't almost there at all." Ethan reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple, uncomplicated by romance or expectation, just one grieving person offering comfort to another. "You did everything you could. Sometimes love isn't enough to stop death from coming. That's the hardest truth there is." They finished the card game in silence, and that evening Ethan brought out one of his books, a collection of poems by Whitman, and read aloud while Rose sewed. His voice was deep and pleasant, and the words washed over her like water, sometimes incomprehensible but always soothing. This became their evening ritual. After supper, Ethan would read while Rose worked on mending or knitting. He had a surprising collection of books, poetry, philosophy, novels by Dickens and Hawthorne, even a volume of Greek myths. When Rose asked how he'd acquired them, he shrugged. Traders bring them sometimes. I trade pelts for them. Books are the one luxury I allow myself. He ran his hand over the worn cover of the Whitman. They remind me there's a bigger world out here, even when I'm alone with just the mountains. You're an unusual man, Ethan Shepard. He glanced up, something unreadable in his expression. Unusual good or unusual bad, just unusual. I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you. I could say the same about you, Rose Nolan. Most women would have been terrified coming to a stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere. But you've been nothing but brave. I don't feel brave. I feel hollowed out. Sometimes brave is just getting up in the morning when everything in you wants to stay in bed. By that measure, you're the bravest person I know. The compliment settled warm in her chest, and Rose bent her head over her sewing to hide the flush in her cheeks. Something was shifting between them, subtle as the season changing, but unmistakable. She wasn't ready to name it, wasn't sure she'd ever be ready, but it was there nonetheless. December arrived with bitter cold and more snow. Ethan kept busy checking his trap lines, and Rose took over most of the indoor chores. She cooked meals from his stores: venison stew, cornbread, dried bean soup, and even a raisin pie that made Ethan close his eyes in appreciation. "Haven't had pie in 4 years," he said, savoring each bite. "Forgot how good it could be. My mother taught me. She said a woman who could bake a good pie would never want for friends. Your mother was a wise woman." Ethan scraped up the last crumbs. "Is she still in Missouri?" "Both my parents died of fever 3 years ago. That's when Thomas and I decided to go west. Nothing left to hold us there." Rose poured them both more coffee. "What about your family?" "Father died when I was young. Mother remarried, had more children. I've got half-siblings back in Pennsylvania, but we lost touch years ago. Sarah was an only child, orphaned young. We only had each other." He stared into his coffee. That made losing her both easier and harder. Easier because there was no one expecting me to carry on, to be strong for them. Harder because I was alone with the grief, no one to share the memories with. I know that feeling now. Rose wrapped her hands around her own cup, seeking its warmth. "I have a brother in Missouri, but we were never close. He didn't approve of Thomas, thought he was a dreamer without prospects. When we left, George didn't even say goodbye. Then he's a fool." The fierceness in Ethan's voice startled her. Their eyes met across the table, and something electric passed between them, sharp and undeniable. Rose looked away first, her heart suddenly racing. It was too soon, far too soon. Thomas had been dead barely a month, but her heart didn't seem to care about propriety or proper mourning periods. Her heart noticed the way Ethan's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness in his large hands, the patience in every word he spoke. Her heart remembered that she was still alive, still capable of feeling things other than grief. That night, lying in the darkness behind the blanket barrier, Rose let herself acknowledge the truth. She was developing feelings for Ethan Shepard. The realization brought equal parts guilt and relief. Guilt because it felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. Relief because feeling anything other than emptiness was proof she might survive this after all. The winter deepened. Outside, the world was buried under snow, the temperature dropping so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and light and the growing ease between two people learning each other's rhythms. Ethan taught Rose to identify animal tracks in the snow, to tell a fox's print from a coyote's. He showed her how to skin a rabbit without damaging the pelt, though she found the work gruesome at first. He explained how he tanned the hides, scraping them clean and treating them with a mixture of animal brains and oils until they were soft as butter. Rose, in turn, taught him to make proper biscuits, to darn socks so the repair was nearly invisible, and to organize his chaotic collection of herbs and medicines. She found he had a surprising knowledge of healing plants, learned from the Shoshone woman who'd saved him. Red Leaf Woman, they called her, Ethan said, crushing dried leaves for tea. She taught me which plants stopped fever, which healed wounds, which could ease pain. Said the land provides everything you need if you know where to look. Is she still alive? Your Red Leaf Woman? I don't know. The Shoshone are nomadic, moving with the seasons. I haven't seen her people since that winter they sheltered me. He poured hot water over the crushed leaves, releasing a sharp, medicinal scent. But I think of her often, try to live in a way that would make her proud, honoring what she taught me. The conversation revealed another layer of Ethan. A man who honored his debts, who learned from those different from himself, who saw wisdom where others might only see savagery. Rose found herself watching him more often, noticing the economical grace of his movements, the thoughtfulness behind every action. Christmas came, and though they had no decorations or traditional feast, Ethan surprised Rose by presenting her with a gift, a pair of fur-lined moccasins he'd made from elk hide, soft and warm and perfectly fitted to her feet. I noticed your boots were thin, he said, almost shy. These will keep you warmer. Rose had nothing to give in return, but she'd been working on a project in secret, sewing late at night after Ethan fell asleep. She presented him with a new shirt, made from fabric she'd found in her trunk, dyed a deep blue that matched his eyes. Rose, he breathed, holding it up. This is fine work. Try it on, he did, and it fit him perfectly, the shoulders broad enough, the sleeves the right length. When he looked at her, his eyes held something warmer than gratitude. Thank you. It's been a long time since anyone made something just for me. They celebrated with the last of Rose's raisins baked into a cake, and Ethan produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving. They each had a small glass, and the liquor burned pleasantly down Rose's throat, making her feel loose and warm. Tell me something about yourself I don't know, Ethan said, relaxed in his chair, the firelight dancing across his face. What do you want to know? Anything. Everything. Your favorite color, your worst fear, the thing you wanted to be when you were a girl. Rose thought for a moment. My favorite color is green, the color of new leaves in spring. My worst fear is being completely alone in the world, forgotten, unmissed. And when I was a girl, I wanted to be a teacher. I loved books, loved learning, and I thought there was no better life than sharing that love with children. She smiled sadly. But my family couldn't afford to send me to normal school, so I took work as a seamstress instead. You still could. Teach, I mean. Silver Peak doesn't have a proper school yet, just parents taking turns with lessons. They'd probably welcome someone with real education. The suggestion planted a seed in Rose's mind, a future she hadn't dared consider. Maybe, what about you? Tell me something I don't know. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his glass. I'm afraid I'll forget what Sarah looked like. I don't have a photograph, and already the details are getting fuzzy. I can remember the color of her hair, but not the exact shade. I remember her laugh, but not the sound of her speaking voice. It feels like losing her all over again, piece by piece. Without thinking, Rose reached across the space between them and took his hand. Tell me about her. Tell me every memory you have. I'll help you hold them. So Ethan talked and Rose listened. He spoke of meeting Sarah at a church social, how she'd challenged him to a shooting contest and won. He described their wedding, small and simple, and their first night together in a hotel room, both of them too shy to speak. He told of their journey west, the laughter and hardships, the way Sarah never complained even when things were difficult. "She would have liked you," Ethan said finally. "She always said I needed someone to match my serious nature with a bit of lightness. But you're not light, are you? You're like me, deep waters. Is that bad? No, it's just different than what I expected to find in someone again." His thumb moved across her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it made her ache. "Rose, I need to be honest with you about something," her heart seized. "What is it?" "I'm developing feelings for you, strong feelings. And I know it's too soon for both of us. We're both still grieving, both still healing. But I can't pretend I don't feel drawn to you, that I don't think about you constantly, that having you here hasn't made this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place I exist." Rose's breath caught. She should have been shocked, should have pulled away, but instead she tightened her grip on his hand. "I feel it too, and I feel so guilty, like I'm betraying Thomas's memory." "You're not betraying anything. Love doesn't die when people do, but it also doesn't mean you can't love again." Ethan met her eyes, his gaze intense. "I loved Sarah with everything I had. I'll always love her. But she's gone and you're here, and my heart apparently has room for both grief and new feeling. What do we do about it? Nothing for now. We take our time. We let whatever this is grow naturally, without rushing or forcing. And when you're ready, truly ready, then we'll see where we stand." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Rose. I have enough for both of us, remember? Enough time, enough patience, enough space for you to heal." The words were a promise and a comfort. Rose nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They sat together by the fire, hands clasped, while the winter wind howled outside and the cabin held them safe. January passed in a blur of snowstorms and quiet days. Rose found herself watching Ethan with new awareness, noticing the way he moved, the sound of his voice, the rare smiles he offered. The attraction between them was like a banked fire, present but carefully controlled, waiting for the right moment to burn freely. They grew more comfortable with small touches. Ethan's hand on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair, Rose brushing snow from his coat when he came in from outside, their fingers meeting when they both reached for the same object. Each touch was innocent but charged with meaning. In early February, a brief thaw melted enough snow that Ethan could check his furthest trap lines. He was gone for 3 days, and Rose discovered how empty the cabin felt without him. She moved through her chores mechanically, counting the hours until his return. When he finally came back, snow-dusted and tired, Rose met him at the door and without thinking threw her arms around him. Ethan stiffened in surprise, then folded her close, his arms strong and sure around her waist. "I missed you," Rose whispered against his chest. "I missed you too. Every minute." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Rose, I need to ask you something, and you can say no, but may I kiss you?" Her answer was to rise on her toes and press her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question and an answer both. Ethan's hand came up to cup her face, his touch reverent, and when they finally broke apart, they were both trembling. "I'm ready," Rose said. "Not to forget Thomas, never that, but to live again, to feel again, to love again if you'll have me, if I'll have you." Ethan laughed, the sound shaky with emotion. "Rose, I've been yours since the moment you put your hand in mine and let me help you from that wagon. I just didn't want to rush you, didn't want to take advantage of your grief. You haven't. You've been nothing but honorable and kind and patient." She touched his face, tracing the line of his beard. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to find out with you." They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, and Rose felt something in her chest unlock, a door she'd thought sealed forever creaking open to let in light. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "We should take this slow. I know. I want to do right by you, court you proper, even if it's just the two of us in this cabin." Rose smiled. "And how do you court someone proper in a mountain cabin?" "I guess we'll figure it out together." The courting that followed was unlike anything Rose had experienced with Thomas. With Thomas, everything had been chaste and supervised, brief meetings in her parents' parlor or at church socials. With Ethan, isolated in their mountain sanctuary, they had the freedom to learn each other without the weight of society's expectations. Ethan began reading love poetry in the evenings, his deep voice caressing words by Keats and Byron. He brought her small gifts from his trap lines: unusual stones, birds' feathers, a perfect pine cone. He taught her to dance with no music but the wind outside, humming old songs his mother had taught him. Rose cooked his favorite meals and sat closer to him by the fire. She laughed more freely, smiled more often. She caught herself singing while she worked, old hymns and folk songs, and realized she was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy. They kissed often but remained chaste, both of them aware that marriage should come before anything more. It was an old-fashioned notion, perhaps, but it felt right to honor what they were building with patience and respect. "When the snows melt," Ethan said one evening, "we'll go to Silver Peak. Find a preacher, make this official if you're willing." "I'm willing." Rose curled closer to his side. They'd abandoned the blanket barrier weeks ago, sharing the bed chastely, finding comfort in proximity. "But I don't need a preacher to tell me what I already know. I love you, Ethan." It was the first time she'd said the words, and they hung in the air, precious and terrifying. Ethan turned to face her, his pale eyes bright in the darkness. "I love you too, Rose. So much it scares me sometimes. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again." They sealed the confession with a kiss that turned heated, hands beginning to wander, before Ethan pulled back with a groan. "We should wait, do this right. I know, but it's hard. The hardest thing I've ever done." He kissed her forehead and pulled her close, her back to his chest, his arm around her waist. "But you're worth the wait, worth everything." March came with the first signs of thaw. Icicles dripping in the afternoon sun, the snowpack settling, the ice on the creek beginning to break. Ethan grew restless, watching the weather, calculating when the pass would be clear enough for travel. "Another few weeks," he said. "Maybe early April. Then we'll make the journey to Silver Peak, get properly married, and decide what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" Rose asked. "Honestly, I'd like to bring you back here, keep living this life we've built, but I know it's not what you signed up for, being isolated in the mountains. If you want to move to Silver Peak, start that school, have neighbors and society, I'll do it. For you, I'd do it." Rose thought about it carefully. The idea of teaching still appealed, but the thought of leaving this cabin, this life they'd created, made her heart ache. "Could we do both? Live here most of the year, but spend winters in Silver Peak. You could sell your furs, I could teach, and we'd still have our sanctuary to return to." Ethan's face broke into a wide smile. "That's a brilliant compromise. Yes, we'll do that." They began planning in earnest, talking about the future with an excitement that felt almost giddy. They'd marry in Silver Peak, spend a month there while Ethan conducted his business and Rose inquired about teaching positions. Then they'd return to the cabin for the summer and fall, preparing for next winter. "We'll need to expand," Ethan said, eyeing the cabin walls. "Build another room or two. If we're going to have children, they'll need space." The casual mention of children made Rose's heart skip. "You want children, don't you?" "Yes, I always did. Thomas and I tried, but it never happened." She touched her stomach, wondering. "Do you think we will have children?" "I hope so. I think you'd be a wonderful mother." Ethan pulled her into his arms. But even if we don't, even if it's just the two of us, that would be enough. You're enough, Rose. The words were a balm to old wounds, the disappointment of a childless marriage that had weighed on her more than she'd admitted. With Ethan, everything felt possible, as if the future was a blank page waiting to be written. By mid-April, the pass was clear enough for travel. They loaded supplies onto Ethan's horse and the pack mule he'd purchased years ago, and set out for Silver Peak. The journey took 4 days, camping along the trail, and Rose saw more of the territory than she had on her grief-stricken journey to Ethan's cabin. The mountains were magnificent, still snow-capped, but with green beginning to show in the valleys. They saw elk and eagles, a black bear fishing in a stream, and once in the distance, what Ethan said was a mountain lion. The nights were cold but bearable, and they slept close to a fire, properly chaperoned by the vast wilderness around them. Silver Peak emerged from the mountain landscape like something from a dream. It was larger than Rose expected, a genuine town with real streets, dozens of buildings, and the constant sound of mining operations echoing from the hills. The main street was muddy with snowmelt, crowded with miners, merchants, and even a few respectable-looking women in proper dresses. They found a hotel first, securing 2 rooms side by side to maintain propriety. Then they sought out the church, a small whitewashed building with a cross on its steeple. The reverend was a round, cheerful man named Pastor Doyle, who seemed delighted to perform a marriage. "We don't get many weddings in Silver Peak," he said, pumping Ethan's hand enthusiastically. "Mostly I'm burying folks or praying over new mines. A wedding is a genuine pleasure." He agreed to perform the ceremony the following Sunday, giving them a week to prepare. Rose needed a new dress, something finer than her worn travel clothes, and Ethan wanted to purchase rings. They spent the week exploring the town, meeting people, and making arrangements. The general store was a revelation after months of isolation. Rose wandered the aisles, marveling at bolts of fabric, tinned goods, and luxuries she'd forgotten existed. She chose a bolt of cream-colored silk for a wedding dress and spent 3 days sewing it by lamplight in her hotel room. Ethan was well known in Silver Peak, Rose discovered. He'd been trading there for years, and people greeted him warmly, asking about his winter, commenting on the quality of his furs. When they learned he was getting married, the news spread like wildfire. "The mountain man's getting hitched," Rose overheard a miner say. "Never thought I'd see the day." The hotel owner, a motherly woman named Mrs. Patterson, took Rose under her wing. She helped with the dress, offered advice, and even organized a small reception to follow the ceremony. "Every bride deserves a proper celebration," she declared. Sunday arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine. Rose dressed in her new gown, her hair arranged in soft curls by Mrs. Patterson, a borrowed necklace at her throat. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not a widow in mourning but a bride, radiant with hope and love. The church was packed, seemingly half the town crammed into the pews. Rose was surprised until she realized that entertainment was scarce in a mining town, and a wedding was an event not to be missed. She walked down the aisle alone, no father to give her away, but she didn't need one. She was choosing this herself, walking toward her future with open eyes and an open heart. Ethan waited at the altar in a new suit, his hair trimmed, his beard neat, looking both nervous and joyful. When Rose reached him, he took her hands, and his whispered, "You're beautiful," made her eyes sting with happy tears. Pastor Doyle performed a simple but heartfelt ceremony. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other, and when Ethan slipped a gold band on her finger, Rose felt something settle in her soul, a sense of rightness and belonging. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Doyle announced with a grin. Ethan did, thoroughly, to the applause and cheers of the congregation. When they broke apart, both laughing, Rose felt lighter than air, as if she might float away if Ethan wasn't holding her hand. The reception at the hotel was lively and loud, with music provided by a fiddler, food contributed by various townspeople, and dancing that lasted into the evening. Rose danced with Ethan, with Pastor Doyle, with miners who were surprisingly light on their feet, and with Mrs. Patterson, who twirled her around until they were both breathless with laughter. As the sun set and the celebration began to wind down, Ethan pulled Rose aside. "Ready to go, Mrs. Shepard." The name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Shepard, Rose Shepard. It sounded right, like coming home. "Yes. Take me home." They said their goodbyes, accepted congratulations and well wishes, and retreated to their hotel rooms. Except this time, they only needed one. Ethan carried her over the threshold, an old tradition that made Rose laugh, and set her down gently in the lamplight. The laughter faded as they looked at each other, suddenly aware that this was their wedding night, that nothing stood between them now except their own nervousness. "I'm not very experienced," Rose admitted, her cheeks flushing. "Thomas and we were both so innocent, and we never really figured out how to make it less awkward. We'll figure it out together." Ethan cupped her face, his touch gentle. "We don't have to rush, we have all night, all our lives." But the months of restrained passion, of careful touches and interrupted kisses, had built something between them that couldn't be denied much longer. When Ethan kissed her, Rose melted against him, and they made their way to the bed in a tangle of eager hands and whispered endearments. What followed was tender and sweet, and occasionally clumsy as they learned each other's bodies. Ethan was patient, attentive to her responses, and Rose discovered that intimacy could be joyful instead of merely dutiful. They laughed and gasped and whispered declarations of love, and when it was over they lay tangled together, both marveling at the connection they'd found. "I love you," Rose whispered, tracing patterns on Ethan's chest. "I love you too, so much." He kissed her temple. "Thank you for trusting me. For choosing me. I'd choose you 1,000 times over." They made love again in the night and once more in the early morning, learning and exploring, building a physical intimacy to match the emotional bond they'd already formed. By the time they finally rose and dressed, the sun was high, and they were both starving. The month in Silver Peak passed in a happy blur. Rose inquired about teaching and found enthusiastic interest from several families. They arranged that she would return next winter to run a proper school, 4 months of lessons for any child who wanted them. The pay would be modest, but it would be hers, earned by her own labor. Ethan sold his furs for excellent prices and purchased supplies for the cabin: tools, nails, window glass, seeds for an expanded garden. They bought books, fabric, and small luxuries that would make their isolated life more comfortable. But mostly, they were eager to return to their mountain sanctuary, to begin their life together in earnest. When they finally set out in early May, both astride horses now, with the pack mule loaded with supplies, Rose felt like she was truly going home. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, still standing strong, the valley around it exploding with spring wildflowers. Rose stood in the doorway and breathed deep, smelling pine and earth and new growth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Shepard," Ethan said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "It's good to be home." And she meant it with her whole heart. The summer was glorious. They worked side by side, expanding the cabin with a second bedroom for future children, planting an enormous garden and improving the barn. Ethan taught Rose to shoot, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit a target more often than not. She taught him to cook more complex meals, and they spent evenings experimenting with recipes, sometimes succeeding, sometimes creating disasters they laughed over. They made love often, in the bed, in the meadow on sunny afternoons, once in the creek on a hot day that left them both gasping with laughter and pleasure. Rose had never imagined marriage could be this joyful, this easy, this filled with both passion and friendship. By August, Rose suspected she might be pregnant. Her courses, which had always been regular, failed to appear, and she felt queasy in the mornings. She waited to tell Ethan until she was certain, not wanting to disappoint him if she was wrong. But by September, there was no doubt. Her belly had begun to swell, and she felt flutters of movement inside. She chose a perfect evening after a dinner of venison and fresh vegetables from their garden to share the news. "Ethan, I have something to tell you." He looked up from the saddle he was mending, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." The leather and tools clattered to the floor as Ethan surged to his feet. He crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she squeaked in protest. When he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes. "A baby, we're having a baby." He touched her stomach reverently. "When?" "I think late February or early March. We'll be in Silver Peak by then so I can have help." "A baby," he repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Then he kissed her, deep and thorough, pouring all his joy and love into the gesture. "You've made me the happiest man alive, Rose Shepard." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Rose felt well aside from occasional tiredness, and she continued her normal activities until Ethan started fussing over her like a mother hen. He didn't want her lifting anything heavy, climbing ladders, or venturing far from the cabin. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," Rose protested after he'd carried her over a patch of rough ground that she could have walked perfectly well. "I know, but humor me. I can't lose you." The vulnerability in his voice stopped her protests. She'd forgotten, sometimes, that Ethan had lost his first wife, that pregnancy and childbirth carried real risks, especially in the wilderness. "You won't lose me. I'm strong, and I'll be in Silver Peak with the doctor nearby. Everything will be fine." He nodded but continued to hover, and Rose let him because she understood. They were both learning that love meant vulnerability, meant risking your heart on someone else's continued existence. They moved to Silver Peak in January, renting a small house on the edge of town for the winter months. Rose, now heavily pregnant, began teaching immediately, and she loved it. The children, ranging from 6 to 14, were eager and bright, and she found genuine fulfillment in shaping young minds. Ethan spent his days selling furs, making contacts with merchants, and preparing for the baby. He built a cradle from pine, sanding it smooth and carving small animals into the headboard. He purchased blankets, tiny clothes, and every book on infant care he could find. Rose's labor began on a cold morning in late February. Ethan fetched the doctor, a gruff but competent man named Dr. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson, who served as midwife. Rose labored through the day and into the night, Ethan holding her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement. "You can do this. You're the strongest woman I know. Just a little more, my love." Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, their son entered the world with a lusty cry. Dr. Brennan placed the baby in Rose's arms, and she stared down at the tiny, perfect face, overcome with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "A boy," she whispered. "Ethan, we have a son." Ethan, who'd been stoic through the entire ordeal, broke down completely. He wept as he touched his son's tiny hand as the baby's fingers wrapped around his own. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Thank you, Rose, thank you." They named him Samuel Shepard after Ethan's father, and he was the light of their lives. Ethan proved to be a devoted father, rising for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours simply holding his son, marveling at the miracle they'd created. Rose recovered quickly, and by April they were ready to return to the mountain cabin. Traveling with an infant was challenging, but Samuel proved to be an easy baby, content to ride in a sling against Rose's chest or sleep in a basket balanced on the pack mule. The cabin welcomed them back, and their life found a new rhythm. Rose balanced motherhood with maintaining their home, and Ethan divided his attention between providing for his family and doting on his son. They were tired, overwhelmed at times, but blissfully happy. The years that followed were full and rich. They returned to Silver Peak each winter, where Rose taught and Ethan conducted business. Each spring, they went back to their mountain home, living the isolated life they both craved. They added to their family a daughter named Sarah after Ethan's first wife, born 2 years after Samuel, and then another son, Thomas, in honor of Rose's first husband, 2 years after that. Rose had worried that naming the children after their lost spouses might be painful, but instead, it felt like honoring the past while embracing the future. Both Ethan and Rose spoke openly about Sarah and Thomas to their children, making sure those memories remained alive and cherished. "Your papa's first wife was very brave," Rose told Sarah one evening as she braided her daughter's red hair, so like the Sarah she'd never met. "She would have loved you very much." "And your first husband wanted to build an orchard," Ethan told Thomas as they planted apple saplings behind the cabin. "He would have been proud to see these trees growing." The children grew strong and happy, wild as the mountains around them, but with good hearts and sharp minds. Samuel proved to be a natural tracker like his father. Sarah had her namesake's courage and her mother's love of learning. Thomas was gentle and dreamy, content to spend hours reading or watching clouds drift over the peaks. Rose and Ethan's love deepened with each passing year. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when the children were asleep, keeping alive the passion and friendship that had brought them together. They danced in the cabin on winter evenings, went for walks by moonlight in summer, and never let a day pass without saying, "I love you." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Rose to the spot where he'd first found her, sitting grief-stricken in that wagon. A wooden cross still marked Thomas's grave, and they stood there together, hands clasped, remembering. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked quietly. "Coming with me that day, choosing this life?" Rose looked at him, at the face she'd come to love more than her own, and smiled. "Not for a single moment. You saved me, Ethan. You gave me your strength when I had none, your hope when I'd lost mine. You gave me a home, a family, a life I never could have imagined. How could I regret that? I could say the same. You brought light back into my darkness." He pulled her close, resting his chin on her head. "When I saw you sitting there, so lost and broken, something in me recognized something in you. Two people who'd lost everything, finding each other." "I arrived with nothing but grief," Rose murmured, "and I said I had enough for both, asked you to stay and heal. You had enough for both of us and more. Enough love to fill all the empty spaces, enough patience to let me find my way back to life, enough faith to believe we could build something beautiful from our broken pieces." They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and when they finally turned to leave, it was hand in hand, partners in every sense, walking toward home and the life they'd built together. Years continued to pass, measured in seasons and celebrations. Samuel grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, and eventually took a wife from Silver Peak, a miner's daughter with a quick laugh and capable hands. They built their own cabin a few miles from Ethan and Rose's, close enough for help but far enough for independence. Sarah, fierce and independent, surprised them all by becoming a deputy sheriff in Silver Peak, one of the few women in the territory to hold such a position. She never married, claiming she was married to justice, and Rose couldn't have been prouder. Thomas, gentle Thomas, became a teacher like his mother, taking over her school in Silver Peak when Rose finally decided to retire. He married a quiet woman who loved books as much as he did, and they had 4 children who filled their home with laughter. Ethan and Rose grew old together in their mountain cabin. His hair turned silver, his body grew less flexible, but his eyes still lit up when Rose entered a room. Her face gained lines, her hands grew arthritic, but she still smiled at Ethan the same way she had on their wedding day. They were sitting on the porch one summer evening, watching the sun set over the peaks they'd loved for 40 years when Rose spoke. "You remember the day we met?" Ethan chuckled. "How could I forget? You looked half dead, stubborn enough to sit there until you froze. And you said you had enough for both, that I should stay and heal. Best decision I ever made, asking you to stay." Rose reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after decades of practice. "I was thinking about grief today, how it changes shape over time. When Thomas died, it was this huge, crushing weight, so heavy I could barely breathe. But you taught me that grief can soften, can become something you carry alongside joy instead of it. You taught me the same thing about Sarah, that remembering her didn't mean I couldn't love you, that the heart has infinite capacity for love, even after loss." Ethan raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "I've loved you for 40 years, Rose Shepard, and I'll love you for however many more we have. And I'll love you. Always." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. The mountains stood eternal around them, the creek sang its endless song, and in the cabin behind them, the life they'd built together stood as testament to the healing power of love. Rose thought of the woman she'd been, arriving with nothing but grief, certain her life had ended. She thought of Ethan, isolated and alone, convinced he'd never love again. 2 broken people who found each other in the wilderness and discovered that healing was possible, that love after loss was not a betrayal but a triumph, that from the ashes of grief could grow something beautiful and enduring. She squeezed Ethan's hand and he squeezed back, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, watching the stars appear, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they had every challenge and joy for the past 4 decades. They had been enough for each other. More than enough. They had built a life, raised children, created a legacy of love that would ripple through generations. And if that wasn't a happy ending, Rose thought, then she didn't know what was. The mountains stood witness as they had always stood, eternal and unchanging, while beneath their peaks, 2 people who had found each other in the darkest moment proved that hope endures, love heals, and grief, when shared and honored, can transform into something beautiful beyond measure. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their love eternal as the mountains themselves. And in the valley where a widow had once arrived with nothing but grief, a family flourished, proof that sometimes the end of one story is simply the beginning of another, better one.